we'll have an opportunity to submit, talk about how they interpreted what they heard and what they learned and whether it was useful to them, what they feel about the upcoming legislation. And the BCAM is going to be taking that information and doing a what we heard report that will be shared with everyone that attended the sessions and also with the emergency management and climate readiness. Our objectives are, of course, to initiate community sharing and learning together, ensuring that we all have a common understanding of the Emergency Program Act that is being updated and a good sense, a good footing for moving forward. After those 3 sessions, there will be sessions hosted on the development of regulations. This is going to be an opportunity for people to actually give some input into their perspective on what they feel would be important in the regulation process. So I do encourage you to all register for those sessions as well, so you have that opportunity. Just a few ground rules. We would like you to please stay on mute. If you could also close your camera down during the presentation, because just to keep the bandwidth open for everyone so that they can hear and see the presentation. If you have any questions or you have comments that you'd like to make tonight, there are 3 opportunities. 1 is you can just type it right into the chat. 2, if you'd like to remain anonymous with your comments or questions, you can type them into the Slido deck, which is actually, there's a link to the Slido and a password right in our chat function right now. And there's also, you could reach out to outreach@bcaam.ca and insert your questions or comments there, just so that everyone has an opportunity to put information into this process. And we really look forward to what we learned tonight and as we go through this process with emergency management and climate readiness and all of you. So this is one of the benefits of becoming a member of BCAM. We are in the process of, we've held other webinar sessions and we will continue to be having other sessions through this process, but hopefully in other ways as well. And we're always looking for ways to educate and help support the emergency management professionals in British Columbia. So thank you for joining us tonight. So we'll also be using everything in the chat and everything in the Slido deck to help with the report building that we're going to be doing as well. So just so you know that. And at this time, I will turn it over to Keith Preston with Emergency Management and Climate Readiness.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I wouldn't mind if anybody on the camera can just give me a wave and let me know that you can hear my voice. Perfect. Thank you. I usually figure if I'm on mute, I'll find out soon enough anyway, but good to know you can hear me. I'm here tonight with my colleague, Katie Olthius. I am the Executive Director of Policy and Legislation for Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. And Katie is our Director of Policy and Legislation. And first off, I would just like to acknowledge with gratitude that both myself and my colleague Katie have joined from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking peoples. And today these are known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And our offices and homes are here on their beautiful traditional territory in the communities of Victoria and Esquimalt. And we had been hoping to have our minister be able to join us to share a few opening remarks tonight, but unfortunately, we don't have the benefit of having her here. Noting that, I'll just say that we geared the length of this presentation with a little extra time for some opening remarks in mind. So we may get a bit of extra time at the end. We'll see. It really has been a long road getting here, and it's very exciting to have reached this point where the statute that is in draft form right now is ready for introduction in the fall session. And as you know, this is the first in a series of 5 webinars that we have planned, not including those reflection sessions that are also planned. And those are additional to these core kind of overview and focus sessions. And we're pleased that just in time for these webinars, we've been able to release a technical paper that provides readers with some more detail than what we've previously been able to release publicly on the design of the proposed legislation. And you can find that on our website. I wish there was a really quick and easy way to tell you how to get there. I think the fastest is really just Googling. Oh, there's a link. That's fantastic. I was going to say Google BC Modernized Emergency Management Legislation. That's usually how I get there. So what we'll be doing in today's session, excuse me, is a quick refresher on what's brought us to this point in terms of consultation and engagement. And to add to that, our co-development process with First Nations. And we'll also get into a really broad, high-level overview of the policies that are underpinning the new legislation. And as is typical for many bills that are introduced in the legislature, not everything in the bill will come into force right away. So we'll get into that phased approach a bit. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, good. We are on the right side. Forgot I'm not driving this deck. We'll talk about the phased approach to help you understand what parts of the legislation will be effective as soon as royal assent comes, and what parts are tied to other milestones. And then finally, we also have regulations that will be made under the new statute. So we'll talk a bit about what that means, both in terms of subject matter and their effect on the legislation. And we'll talk about what the ministry is planning in terms of engagement, as some of those key regulations are designed and drafted. And the future sessions, as you've probably seen online, will be themed. So this is just a reminder that while today is a high-level overview, we'll be drilling down into some more focused discussions on how the legislation deals with response and recovery. That's on July 12th. Planning and risk assessment will be on July 26th. Agreements and collaboration on August 9th. And consultation and cooperation will be on August 23rd. And I see we're on this short slide here. So just before we get into the material, just to echo a few ground rules off the top, I wanted to say, just like emergency management, legislation can be high stakes. I know if my wife were listening, she would laugh at me if I were saying legislation can be high stakes. As a legislation person, it feels that way. It definitely can be polarizing. And the purpose of these webinars is to share information. And we just want to make sure we're doing this in an atmosphere where we recognize that we're all people. Let's go to the next slide, please. Great, thanks. So quickly, just a refresher on what this process has looked like. If you did download the technical paper, there's more detail on this on page 5. To start off, BC adopted the Sendai framework in 2018, and close on the heels of that, we moved to engage on a new legislative framework for emergency management. There was an initial discussion paper that was released in 2019, and we took feedback from the public, local authorities, First Nations, volunteer groups, and others that are invested in emergency management as part of a formal engagement period that ran into 2020. And following that engagement, we released a What We Heard report that summarized the feedback that we received and showed how some of the early ideas had shifted to respond to that feedback. And as everyone knows, COVID took center stage in 2020. And well, EMBC, as we were at the time, was heavily involved in BC's response to COVID-19. There was some early work that was happening behind the scenes to turn those ideas and feedback into draft legislation. And that work started that same year in 2020, at least in a limited capacity. And through everything that was going on in 2021, in terms of events, that work continued through to the point where by 2022, when I happened to join this project, we started to see some capacity to co-develop the legislation return among our First Nations partners. And that's where we've been for the past year and a bit. So I'm going to pause just for a minute to talk about the whys and the whats of co-development. So BC passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in 2019. And a core implication of that is a new legal obligation on the government to take all measures necessary to ensure that its laws are consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I'll probably say UNDRIP or the UN Declaration for the rest of this presentation. So that UN Declaration represents an international understanding of rights that have over centuries been suppressed, ignored, or erased by governments and societies. So given that, policy branches like mine are working under the guidance of a new centralized area of government that's called the Declaration Act Secretariat. And this is to ensure that we're living up to this new legal requirement. The process has been called co-development, and it means working closely with Indigenous partners to develop legislation. And in our case, this legislation is very land-based. It affects people on a geographic basis. It can temporarily infringe on people's rights to use land. So as First Nations peoples have land-based rights in BC, this means that our co-development process has been focused on First Nations. We've had frequent meetings with technical tables representing the First Nations Leadership Council and the member nations of the Alliance of BC Modern Treaty Nations. And we've also held a number of sessions with rights and title holders. Draft legislation has been shared with First Nations partners through confidentiality agreements. And it's through this kind of sharing and dialogue that we've ensured that there's a strong alignment between the draft statute and the UN Declaration. And now on to our current status along the bottom of this slide. We're working this summer to promote awareness and to understand, design, and provide supports that communities will need to successfully implement the legislation. So in this vein, we have the recently released technical paper, and we're doing the webinar series that we're in right now with the BC AEM, just as a couple of examples. And the government intends to introduce the statute into the Legislative Assembly in the fall session. And that session spans the months of October and November this year. So we expect it will work its way through to becoming law over those months. And we've already turned our minds to regulations that need to be made under the statute. And I won't get into detail on those yet, as we'll be talking about those later. Let's go to the next slide, please. Can we go to slide 5? Perfect, thank you. So we're accustomed to a very short piece of legislation when we think about what's in the Emergency Program Act and its regulations. And what you'll see when the new legislation is introduced is that it's grown. If you're looking at the new technical paper, page 6 provides a similar overview to what you see here on this slide. And this slide is all about things that differ from the current legislation. So consideration of goals, such as alignment with Sendai, alignment with UNDRIP, learning from people with lived experience from recent emergencies and disasters, and consideration of the ways in which emergencies can affect people in different and sometimes disproportionate ways has meant that the legislation needs to speak to a lot more things. So the themes you see highlighted here represent the key ways in which the new legislation will differ from the EPA. Some of these are quite extensive themselves, so they're not necessarily simple changes as what might be implied by just putting a few words in a box here on this slide, but they can have implications that actually extend through the full statute, ultimately into the future regulations and into our practice as emergency managers. And we'll move through each of these boxes in the slides to come. And again, we'll remind folks that there will be 4 more focused webinars in the weeks to come where we spend the full hour on some of these themes. So at this point in our presentation, I'd like to hand it over to Katie Olthius, our Director of Policy and Legislation. She played a key role in the drafting of the statute that will be introduced in the fall.
Thanks, Keith. If we can move to slide number 6. So this slide is a fairly basic one to review. For anybody familiar with the Emergency Program Act, you'll know that it's fairly heavily response focused. Yes, there are some preparation pieces in the way that the regulations require emergency plans to be made by government ministers and local authorities. And the existence of the Disaster Financial Assistance Program is a nod to recovery, but the EPA is not particularly well-rounded. We know from Sendai that disaster risk reduction is fundamental to emergency management. We know that time and money spent up front can save lives, properties, and costs in the later phases. So the new legislation approaches emergency management from that perspective. It is much more deliberate when it comes to requirements for preparing, reviewing, and revising risk assessments, emergency management plans, and business continuity plans. Risk assessments and emergency management plans can help prioritize mitigation work, and the legislation will also include an authority for the minister to order mitigation measures to be taken. And we'll talk about response and recovery in a few slides, but I'll just briefly say here that generally, response powers from the EPA are carried forward. There are some new ones, and the most significant change for the recovery phase is the introduction of the concept of recovery periods. Again, we'll dive a little deeper into that in a few minutes, and there will be a focused webinar on the response and recovery phases on July 12th. We can move to the next slide, please. Something we're recognizing with the new legislation is the notion of co-management. We already have this today, where in the EPA, we see statutory recognition of local government decision-making authority within their jurisdictional boundaries, and we have concurrent and overlapping decision-making authority by the province. For instance, sometimes we see a state of local emergency declared, actions taken pursuant to that locally, and then a state of provincial emergency is declared and actions are taken pursuant to that. When a provincial declaration is made, sometimes the states of local emergency will be cancelled, but that's not an automatic outcome of the provincial declaration. What's different with the new legislation is we'll see a recognition that the inherent right of self-government of Indigenous peoples includes the ability to make laws concerning emergency management. This is not something that the legislation changes or creates. This is an inherent right, meaning it already exists. However, the statute will acknowledge it. In so doing, the intention is to also recognize Indigenous governing bodies that represent First Nations peoples with land-based rights are also decision makers in emergency management in the same way that local authorities and the province are. That's a good way, segue into slide number 8, which is to talk about guiding principles that will be included in the legislation. So the Modernized Emergency Management Statute will include a clause that sets out a series of guiding principles. This is relatively unique for BC legislation. These principles set the frame for the legislation and can ultimately affect the way that it's interpreted. The list you see here is based on the list set out on page 6 of the technical paper. We won't talk about each of these right now because some of them are conceptually linked to other slides in this presentation. But let's start by saying that the principle of acknowledging and respecting the authority of all decision makers is very much tied to the co-management concept we were just talking about. This is something we heard in our conversations with First Nations partners. While in some cases, there were no issues or relatively few issues with non-Indigenous actors accepting the validity of actions they took in emergencies, in other cases, there were issues. So when there's a principle that speaks to acknowledging and respecting authority that goes hand in hand with some of these other principles, for instance, working towards coordination, collaborating on matters of mutual interest, recognition of Indigenous lawmaking authority in the emergency management sphere, and others. In terms of some of those other principles, Some are call-outs to the Sendai priorities. For example, the one in the middle box speaks to recognizing the importance of investing in measures to reduce risk and promote resiliency, which aligns with the third priority of Sendai. We also see a priority pertaining to the linkage between climate change and emergencies, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Again, I'm not going to go through each of them, but our next slide talks in part about the cultural safety principle. So as you see here, these are all goals that inform the design of the legislation, and they're all related to each other in certain ways. The all of society concept promoted by Sendai means a few things in relation to the new legislation. First, where the Emergency Program Act really only speaks to the province and local authorities, we'll see the new legislation carve out planning obligations for critical infrastructure owners and create room for a framework through which standards, protocols, and procedures can be applied to volunteers. We'll also see clear, more comprehensive statutory immunity or civil liability protections for volunteers and other actors, and employment protections for volunteers. All of society also gets the very intentional recognition of Indigenous peoples as decision makers, and also other ways in which Indigenous peoples are included, such as provisions for the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, stewardship, input, and advice in emergency management. All of society means that we need to be able to do emergency management in a culturally safe way, and the legislation will provide tools for that. For example, by ensuring that emergency management plans are considerate of cultural safety needs, or by providing room for further rules to be made regarding training programs that can help promote culturally safe practices. And finally, another recent change to the way the government has been doing policy and legislation is the inclusion of gender-based analysis plus as a deliberate feature of our policy process. In this project, it means thinking about how people are affected by emergencies and disasters differently or disproportionately. This can get at physical proximity to hazards, but it also means thinking about racism and other forms of discrimination. We can move to the next slide, please. As Keith mentioned, this work began some time ago, back before this ministry was created. Emergency Management BC at the time existed as an agency and has been housed under different ministries at different points in time. What's becoming clear is that climate change is affecting hazards in such a way that the frequency and magnitude of emergencies like floods and wildfires has been getting worse very quickly as time goes on. The creation of this ministry, the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, or what we refer to as EMCR, is part of that realization. With EMCR being the ministry to get this legislation over the finish line, we'll also see the legislation include some strong linkages to climate change. We've already seen the linkage between the climate change and emergencies in the Principles Clause. We'll also see the new legislation require consideration of climate change as part of every risk assessment. All regulated entities, that is provincial ministries, public sector agencies, local authorities, and critical infrastructure owners, will need to prepare risk assessments. Risk assessments are discussed on page 13 of the new technical paper, and we'll be going into detail on this topic at our focused webinar for planning and risk assessment on July 26th. The legislation will also provide that emergency management plans need to be built on what these regulated entities find in the risk assessments. So in that way, consideration of how the climate interacts with any given hazard will have impacts that flow through to emergency management plans. To the next slide, please. The definition of the term emergency is critical to the legislation. Currently, the Emergency Program Act definition refers to conditions that may be imminent, ongoing, or that have occurred, and that require the prompt coordination of action or special regulations of persons or property. The definition also requires that such conditions be attributable to accidents, fire, explosions, technical failures, or forces of nature. This overall design will be retained. There will be some changes to address gaps in the current definition. New references to transmissible diseases and environmental toxins will help address what some might see as ambiguity in the words forces of nature or accidents. And new references to certain types of intentional human-driven actions like rioting, security threats, and terrorist activity will ensure that the legislation can be used if and when those types of emergency arise. And the legislation will also speak to risks to objects or sites of heritage value. A risk to these things alone will not give rise to an emergency within the statutory sense, but when those risks result from things like accidents, fire, or the new kinds of conditions I've just mentioned, that would bring you within the statutory meaning of emergency. On to the next slide, please. This slide looks at response and recovery. We will save most of the details here of our upcoming webinar on July 12th, but can also let you know that there's some more details related to this on pages 8 and 9 of the technical paper. Appendix 2 of the paper also provides a good overview of the powers available and covers off who can use the powers, when the powers can be used, and whether consultation and cooperation with Indigenous governing bodies is required ahead of using a power. What's important to cover today is, in general, what exists today in terms of response powers from the Emergency Program Act will be carried forward into the new legislation. There are 3 new powers you see here, and these are all based on lessons learned from recent events. We also have some important changes to the duration of states of emergency. The one duration that doesn't change is a state of provincial emergency declared by the minister. This remains at 14 days before an extension is required. If the Lieutenant Governor and Council declares a state of provincial emergency, it will last for 28 days. This 28-day term also applies to extensions of states of provincial emergency, including states of emergency originally declared by the minister. States of local emergency, which currently last for 7 days, will last for 14 days under the new legislation before an extension is required. And on this last slide, recovery periods will be a feature of the new legislation. These will enable both the province and local authorities to mark the formal shift from the response phase to the recovery phase. More practically, they will provide continued access for renewable periods of 90 days to a range of powers that were available during the response phase. The intention here is that the province and local authorities will look to this tool instead of extending states of emergency into the recovery phase. This will help preserve the psychological effect of states of emergency. We want people to stand up and take note when there's a state of emergency, and that gets hard to do, and people get fatigued if states of emergency are used for too long. Move over to the next slide, please. We'll spend a bit of time on this slide because these are some very significant changes. You can find more information on what we're talking about on pages 10 to 13 of the technical paper. And we'll have 2 focused webinars on policies concerning Indigenous peoples and the Indigenous governing bodies that they authorize to act for them. We've talked about the province's legal obligation to ensure its legislation is aligned with the UN Declaration. This was time-consuming hard work, and as staff, we need and want to recognize the important contribution of Indigenous partners to this legislation. The discussions we've had and the detailed and considerate reviews of the policies and the legislation that were performed by Indigenous partners truly led to a stronger, more robust piece of legislation. The work won't end here. As we all become familiar with the legislation and as government ministries, local authorities, and critical infrastructure owners start to get some practical experience with this new framework, there will need to be continued conversations and actions to coordinate our work within this co-managed system. As we've already discussed, everything starts with the recognition that the inherent right of self-government includes the right to make laws in relation to emergency management. As we've also discussed, this is land-based subject matter. So we're talking about First Nations peoples who hold land-based rights in BC. This right has already been exercised by First Nations peoples in various ways. For example, we've seen First Nations communities implement measures to minimize the transmission of COVID-19, and First Nations have taken an active hand in responding to wildfires and other emergencies. Recognizing this right does not create anything new, but the legislation signals that First Nations peoples making laws and taking actions are decision makers in emergency management, just like the province and local authorities. Now is a good time to talk about what an Indigenous governing body is. This is a term that's been used in a few pieces of BC legislation and in some federal legislation. The new emergency management legislation will adopt, by reference, the definition used in BC's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. That definition refers to an entity that is authorized to act on behalf of Indigenous peoples that hold rights recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982. One of the most important things to note with respect to that definition is that it's Indigenous focused. It puts decisions about Indigenous governing bodies in the hands of Indigenous peoples. It's not up to the province, local authorities, or others to designate who is or who isn't an Indigenous governing body. This is strictly a decision for Indigenous peoples. So the legislation contains references to Indigenous governing bodies, and will need to be done over the coming months, both ahead of and after the introduction of the legislation, to ensure those IGBs make themselves known to local authorities and the province. In our focused webinars of August 9th and August 23rd, we'll discuss that in greater detail. Now that we've talked about recognition and IGBs, let's talk about two key ways in which the legislation will relate to IGBs: agreements and consultation and cooperation. First, agreements. There are 3 types of agreements listed here, and the focus session for those will be on August 9th. But for today's purposes, I'll briefly describe each of these. All of these are described on page 11 of the technical paper. CEMAs are something you may already be familiar with. This stands for Collaborative Emergency Management Agreement, and we currently have one of these in BC. It's a tripartite agreement between the SILCO team, the province, and the Government of Canada. The purpose of CEMAs is to identify common goals and objectives in emergency management and to map out ways for collaborating to get there. The modernized legislation won't specifically reference CEMAs, but it will include a broad authority to make agreements, and that will provide continued authority for our existing CEMA and enable the making of further agreements. Next, we have coordination agreements. These can be used to further the coordination and harmonization of emergency management procedures, or they can also formalize certain aspects of how emergency management can work in a co-managed environment that recognizes the land-based authority of First Nations. Coordination agreements can be negotiated in relation to areas within the traditional treaty territories of First Nations peoples, and they would be made between the province and an Indigenous governing body that represents those peoples. Local authorities could also be parties to these agreements. This type of agreement can make space for an IGB's actions during the response and recovery phases by doing various things, including have the province or a local authority agree to refrain from exercising particular statutory powers in certain areas, or by putting conditions on the exercise of statutory response or recovery powers by the province or local authorities. For example, if an Indigenous governing body intends to manage evacuations for First Nations peoples it represents in a certain area, the agreement might provide that the province and or local authority won't make evacuation orders that apply to that area, or it might provide conditions, like if the province or local authority makes an order that affects that area, will also take actions or provide resources to facilitate that evacuation. And the third type of agreement referenced here is the joint or consent-based decision-making agreement. This is not unique to this legislation. These were introduced as part of the Declaration Act in 2019, and the new emergency management legislation will simply ensure that they can be used in relation to decisions under the new statute. As compared to coordination agreements, joint or consent-based decision-making agreements are focused on in-the-moment decisions and can require that a decision maker named by the statute, such as the minister or a local authority, must exercise their decision either jointly with an IGB or only after obtaining the consent of an IGB. These agreements would be negotiated between the minister and an Indigenous governing body, and a mandate from cabinet is required prior to negotiating or entering into a joint or consent-based decision-making agreement. Now moving on to consultation and cooperation. I'll try to be relatively brief here as well, as we'll be having a full hour focus session dedicated to this on August 23rd. Consultation and cooperation prior to implementing legislative or administrative measures is a requirement of Article 19 of the UN Declaration. It comes into play in a few ways under the new legislation. There will be requirements for all regulated entities, so government ministries, public sector agencies, local authorities, and critical infrastructure owners, to consult and cooperate with Indigenous governing bodies as part of preparing or revising their risk assessments and emergency management plans. This will help to promote good communication and collaboration before an emergency takes place and there's need to make quick decisions. And there will be obligations for the province and local authorities to consult and cooperate with IGBs prior to making certain orders in the response and recovery phases. At a high level, these obligations in response and recovery are tied to what you could describe as land-based actions, like evacuations and travel restrictions. There's a full list in Appendix 2 of the technical paper. And very quickly, the last bullet on this slide refers to Indigenous knowledge. This ties back to the guiding principles and valuing the input and advice of Indigenous peoples. What Indigenous knowledge consists of is up to Indigenous peoples. It could be Indigenous ways of knowing, it can be historical, or it could be current. The way this fits into the legislation is through a requirement for risk assessment and emergency management plans to include any available Indigenous knowledge when the assessment or plan is prepared or revised. What we should be clear on is that the provision of Indigenous knowledge is a choice that Indigenous peoples have. If there isn't any provided, that's not an impediment to proceeding with the risk assessment or emergency management plan. If Indigenous knowledge is provided in confidence, the legislation will include protections for it, ensuring that it's only disclosed in certain conditions. And move on to the next slide, please. So finally, to round out our review of new policies, let's talk quickly about accountability and transparency. You can find more details on these topics on pages 15 and 16 of the technical paper. First off, we see 4 types of reporting requirements. The first couple are strictly for the province. EMCR will need to report out on any expenditures it makes using the statutory appropriation. That's a special authority that ensures the province can quickly make expenditures outside of EMCR's base budget. Most often, this will be response or recovery costs beyond those we've budgeted for. And the second one is a requirement for EMCR to submit a report to the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly within 5 business days of exercising a response or recovery power. The third reporting requirement will have both the province and local authorities, depending on who declared a state of emergency or recovery period, to make a summary report within 120 days of the expiry of the state of emergency or recovery period. Generally, these aren't intended to replace after action reviews where we learn things we'd want to do next time. But these are more about summarizing the facts to ensure we're being transparent and accountable. And the last reporting requirement is an ad hoc one. It's an authority for the minister to order a local authority to prepare a report on any matter. We don't anticipate this being used routinely, just where there's a clear need, for instance, when more transparency is needed on a specific particular matter. It's also worth noting that the legislation will include a requirement for a 5-year review to be performed. This is a massive overhaul of our emergency management legislation, and it helps to formalize that part of the policy cycle. We want to ensure there's a deliberate and comprehensive effort to review the efficacy of the legislation and to report out on what we hear as part of that exercise. So Keith, back over to you to discuss implementation.
Great, thank you. Can we go to the next slide, please? Perfect, thanks. So the majority of the statute will be in force upon royal assent, and at that point, the Emergency Program Act will be repealed. And there will be transition rules in the bill that you see introduced in the fall that will preserve aspects of the EPA until the new legislation is fully implemented, so that we don't leave any gaps in planning, for instance. This isn't an exhaustive list that you see here. Rather, it's a summary of the key features that will be available under the legislation as soon as the statute receives royal assent. We've talked about most of these things, but I just want to quickly note a couple of things that we haven't discussed, and we'll make sure that these are discussed in greater detail in future webinars. So first, we talked about agreements with Indigenous governing bodies, and we mentioned that there will be a broad authority to enter into agreements, but one agreement type that we didn't mention is the emergency measures agreement. In general, this type of agreement is envisioned for areas where there is no local authority or where there's an authority other than the local authority that takes responsibility for an area. So for example, this could be a national park. If the minister enters into an emergency measures agreement with what we're calling a participating authority, that participating authority will have powers that are similar to those held by a local authority. And second, we see multi-jurisdictional emergency management organizations mentioned here. And these are discussed on page 15 of the technical paper. In essence, the concept is that multiple local authorities might get together. For instance, a regional district and several municipalities within the regional district, along with possibly Indigenous governing bodies, and or the province. Those could also participate. And the parties to this multi-jurisdictional emergency management organization could collectively fulfill their obligations under the statute. So for instance, doing risk assessments and preparing emergency management plans. And they could also take response and recovery actions as a single unit. And that's intended to potentially create efficiencies for some areas. So again, those are the highlights of what would be available right away when the statute becomes law. Let's have a look at the next slide, please. Thank you. So by contrast, here's what would become available as relevant regulations are made. So first, planning requirements. These apply to all regulated entities, provincial ministries, public sector agencies, local authorities, and critical infrastructure owners. And until regulations for each of these entities are made, the planning requirements under the current Emergency Program Act will be continued. And second, as we'll talk about on the next slide, the new framework for compensation and financial assistance won't take effect until a modernized regulation is made. So until then, we'll continue to use the compensation and disaster financial assistance regulation that is made under the Emergency Program Act. And lastly, there are parts of the compliance and enforcement framework. Most significantly, these are rules for administrative monetary penalties, which is something that we don't have under the current legislation that will require regulations to operate. But there will be key compliance and enforcement tools such as offenses that are functional right away. And the next slide, please. Next. So the government has identified 6 core subject areas as priorities for regulations under the new statute. We see the intended subject matter and timelines here. I'll note that we are just beginning our work on regulations, so the timelines are tentative and they may change. We'll be engaging relevant partners as we work through these regulations, and we'll be co-developing these with First Nations partners. So the first 2 subject areas, general regulations and regulations for government ministries, are planned for this fall, with the goal of having these come into force shortly after the statute receives royal assent. And when the ministry regulations are brought into force, provincial government planning obligations will commence, but there will be time provided for this work to be completed. And next, we see regulations for local authorities. Like ministry regulations, these would complete the planning rules for local authorities. We're targeting a spring 2024 completion, and with that, we'd see local authority planning obligations commence. Again, there would be time provided for this work to be completed, and we will be also releasing a discussion paper and formally engaging on these regulations for local authorities this fall. And that runway between the creation of the planning obligations and the completion of the risk assessments and plans will be part of that conversation. One other thing to note there, a couple other things actually. Another topic for engagement in the fall will be the geographic coverage of planning obligations for regional districts, recognizing that they are very large in a lot of cases, but where there are vast areas of land where there is no population or infrastructure that really merits necessarily the same degree of planning that exists in areas with people and structures and infrastructure. So we'll be consulting on that. I think the one other thing, sorry to mention about local authorities is that the majority of the planning rules for local authorities and other regulated entities are in the statute. So that's a difference from the current legislation where they are largely in regulations. So after local authorities, we're looking at similar regulations for critical infrastructure. We'll be re-engaging soon with partners in the CI world as part of our work to design and draft these regulations. As with the others we've discussed, these regulations will complete the planning obligations for CI, time to complete this work will be provided. And we'll also see the meaning of critical infrastructure prescribed as part of those regulations. And next we have compensation and financial assistance, and this is a really big one. So we'll be consulting broadly on this. We plan to issue a discussion paper, hold formal engagements in the fall. The plan is to come out with a fully functional regulation for late spring 2024, but we recognize that there are some dependencies with timelines that run longer than that, and some really complex issues. So we'll need to continue our work after 2024 and plan for later amendments to these regulations to ensure that the financial assistance framework remains current and responsive. And lastly, we have compliance and enforcement. Also planned for late spring 2024, this regulation will largely be concerned with rules for administrative monetary penalties. And the next slide, please. So over the summer, we will be working on ensuring that there's a common understanding of the legislation. And as we've mentioned, we've recently released a technical paper, and I encourage all of you to download a copy of it. The ministry is working on other guidance materials, templates, and similar supports that can be released in the coming months to help ease us over from the Emergency Program Act and into the new legislation. And as we've been saying, this webinar is part of a series. We'll be offering 4 further sessions in collaboration with the BC AEM. And webinars will dive into the 4 key areas of legislation that you see here. And on to the last slide, please. So we have about 8 minutes remaining in our time. I apologize, I have not managed to keep an eye on the chat.
No worries. Thanks, Keith and Katie, for your presentation. That was great tonight. Oh, I just lost the chat here. Just give me 1 second. We just had a few questions tonight. One request that was in there that I thought was a great suggestion was to add the page numbers to the technical report to your slide deck. You mentioned it throughout your report, but it'd be nice to be able to cross-reference that really quickly. So I thought that was a great idea there. Let me just take a quick look here. We had a couple of questions on Slido. All right, so let's just see here. There was a couple of questions around public sector agencies. What is your definition of a public sector agency? And what are public sector public sector organizations included in it?
So the quick answer to that is it will be defined through regulation. The 6 priority subject areas you saw up on the screen a couple of slides ago are the ones that the government has identified as priorities. And I saw the comment from Kevin, thank you, that was, the slide is supposed to say late spring 2024. We have not completed those regulations yet. So we will have regulations for government ministries, but we'll be looking at public sector agencies and the scope of that, who is subject to rules as a public sector agency will be set as part of those regulations, as will, similar to the other regulated entity regulations we've discussed, any planning requirements that need to be completed beyond the rules that exist in the statute will be added as part of those regulations. So we would be looking out into recognizing that there is an election period next year, at which time we aren't able to make regulations. We'd be looking into probably late 2024 into 2025 for likely timelines to be looking at public sector agencies. Until that time, through the Interpretation Act, provincially, regulations under the Emergency Program Act continue to live on to the extent that they can be read harmoniously with the new statute. So the agencies that are regulated under the Emergency Program Management Regulation would continue to be subject to the requirements of that regulation.
Great, thank you. Another question in the Zoom chat here. Would you have a sample of the gold standard community plan that would meet the way forward for Sendai 2015 to 2030 that has been implemented, reflecting the new BC legislation and standards and a model to follow?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we are working with the planning experts in the ministry to produce templates, materials that are going to support planning by local authorities, by other regulated entities. And as part of that, I think that's a very good suggestion that maybe there be a sample, not just a template. So we'll take that away and share that with our colleagues that are doing that work.
Great, I'm just going to hop over to Slido here. I think there's a couple more questions popping up. How long do you anticipate before the full Act regulations are implemented?
So with the introduction of the core 6 subject areas of regulations, it's a little tough to choose a percentage off the top of my head. I would say we'd be looking at over 90% of the Act being actually effective with the making of those regulations. We would be down to little pieces like those public sector agency planning requirements. There's also some business continuity planning requirements for some provincial entities like the courts, etc., Legislative Assembly, Lieutenant Governor's Office, that may still not be in force after the making of those regulations, but we would be, those smaller pieces would be coming in most likely, I would say 2025. And I would say we're hitting around 100% by then. But the plan is, if we can get through all of those core 6 subject areas, to be most of the way there by spring.
Great, and we've got two more minutes here, so I'll ask one last question. Has First Nations feedback over the past several months been incorporated into this draft?
Yeah, so just a little more detail on co-development. The way that was done is, as I said, we worked with the technical tables, with the Leadership Council, and with the Treaty Nations, and then we went out to rights holders. So there were some sessions kind of at a planning level earlier in 2022. And then in January of this year, we connected with rights holders on kind of a much more advanced kind of state of what the legislation was looking like, and received a lot of comments at that time. And those were taken forward. And pardon me, there were a number of changes made to the statute in between January and April to reflect the feedback that we received from rights and title holders. And ultimately, I would say, yes, there was significant change from those comments, and all of the feedback we've received through co-development really has gone a long way to making this stronger legislation. And I see that comment that just popped up, and that's true. And that's part of the reason, the fact that organizations don't speak on behalf of everybody, that we are trying to get through to rights and title holders directly, and reaching out to chiefs and councils, and having open sessions.
Well,
Great, thank you.
Sorry. I'd like
Go ahead.
to thank you, Keith and Katie, for your presentation tonight. I'd like to thank everyone for their questions. The Slido deck will be available for a while, so you can definitely continue putting questions into that deck. You've got the link to, as long as you have the link up already. So please go ahead. If there are questions that didn't get answered tonight, we will do what we can to answer them for you as we move forward. So I'd like to thank everyone again for coming, and we said we would be finished at 7:30, and it is 7:30 right now. So I'll let everybody go, and thank you very much for your attendance. And Katie and Keith, if you wouldn't mind staying back for a few minutes, so we can just review things.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Deb, do you mind if I stick around as well too, just to hear?
Yeah, that's fine.
Me too. It's April.
BCAM directors, yes.
I'm just wondering, there was a separate meeting booked on our side, and I can't see who was invited to it. It was probably Harps and,
Megan is in that one, so I'm just telling her to come back over here.
okay.
Oh, okay. Do we know who Terry Lynn Grant is? Oh, she's on. Okay, so she can, when she's got a few people still hanging in.
Let me just take a look here. I just have to go through and remove people individually.
You've got all the power.
They get walking away, and that's what happens, right?
Exactly.
We should probably stop the recording as well.
Yes.